I spent some time building this cabinet door and then completely ruined it. Has this ever happened to you? Everything is going so smoothly, and then one screw choice later, you're humbled pretty quick. So, if you're dealing with an issue like this, instead of starting over, which is something I definitely considered here, especially since I couldn't find a single YouTube video showing this exact issue, I wanted to share how I repaired it and got it looking smooth again. So I'm in the middle of building this custom dining hutch. I'm adding a center cabinet between two stock cabinets, and to make it look cohesive, I'm building a door to match. I wanted to match the other cabinet doors, but I also wanted to have a unique detail, so I designed it to look like a few drawer fronts stacked together, even though it's actually one single door. Everything was going really smoothly until it wasn't. When it came time to attach the hinges, I used screws that were just slightly too long. They didn't poke through the other side, but they bulged the MDF, leaving these raised round circles where the screws were. I had tested the screws beforehand because I was using a homemade jig to get really precise alignment of the doors. And the material I used was the same thickness. However, it was plywood and not MDF like the top part of my doors, and that made a big difference. MDF doesn't forgive when you push it to its limits. So here's how I fixed it. I started by removing the screws completely, then used the flat side of a putty knife and pressed firmly over the bulges to try and compress them back down. This helped a little, but definitely not enough. Next, I took a chisel and laid the flat blade across the bulged area. I wasn't trying to gouge or cut it down. I was just using the chisel as a flat guide to gently shave off the rounded top of the bulge. The goal was to make it even with the rest of the surface without digging into the MDF. Once that hump was leveled, I sanded the area smooth. I started with 120 grit, then worked up to 220, and then I finished with a 400 grit. I used my hand and didn't rely on sight to check for the smoothness. With my eyes closed, I couldn't really feel the raised area anymore, so then I moved on to the next step. I rolled on a thin coat of primer and then let that dry completely. And once it was dry, I lightly sanded again just to knock down any surface texture. Then I applied a thin layer of wood filler over the area just to make sure there was no visible dip or texture difference. Once it was dry, I sanded that first with 220 and then with the 400 grit again. I made sure it was completely flat by feeling the surface again with my hand. Finally, I sprayed on one more coat of primer, and I chose to spray this final coat to avoid any uneven buildup that can happen when you roll or brush primer, especially if you're just touching up one area. Once it was dry, I gave it a final light sand with 600 grit sandpaper, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, considering how bad it looked at first. It's smooth, level, and ready for finishing paint. And once it's painted, I don't think you're even going to notice that there was a problem there. So if you ever end up with those annoying bulges from screws in MDF, don't panic. This process took me a little bit of time, but it definitely did work. And if you're like me and can't find a single video showing how to fix this specific problem, hopefully this saves you a ton of frustration and maybe even a rebuild. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button for more real life DIY step-by-step tutorials on all my builds and home inspiration.